Welcome, and thank you for choosing this podcast. Dialogue on Possibility, Realisation Entropy, ChatGPT. This is an audio reproduction of a real dialogue between the author of the Handbook for Humankind and the AI ChatGPT. The male voice is the pen pusher, and the female voice is ChatGPT AI.
Out of interest, what is the origin of the material first ontology?
That's a thoughtful question because material first is less a single doctrine than the result of a long historical development. In broad strokes, its roots go back to the ancient Greek atomists, particularly Leucippus and Democritus. In the 5th century BCE, they proposed that everything consists of indivisible atoms moving through empty space. There was no appeal to consciousness or purpose as fundamental. The world was explained by matter and motion. Later, Epicurus and the Roman poet Lucretius expanded this into a naturalistic worldview in which phenomena could be understood without invoking divine intervention. The decisive shift, however, came during the scientific revolution. Figures such as Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and later Pierre-Simon Laplace developed a picture of the universe as a vast mechanical system governed by mathematical laws. Although Descartes himself believed in both mind and matter, his sharp distinction between them unintentionally encouraged scientists to focus almost exclusively on the measurable material side of reality. By the 19th century, materialism had become increasingly influential through advances in chemistry, biology, and physiology. Charles Darwin showed how biological complexity could arise through evolution by natural selection, reducing the need to invoke special creative acts. At the same time, the growing success of physics suggested that matter obeying universal laws could account for an enormous range of observations. The 20th century strengthened this trend. Quantum mechanics, relativity, genetics, neuroscience, and information theory all achieved remarkable predictive success by treating the physical world as the starting point. Modern neuroscience, in particular, generally assumes that consciousness emerges from the activity of the brain rather than existing independently of it. One important nuance is that many contemporary philosophers would avoid the label material first. Modern physics no longer thinks of the universe as made of tiny billiard ball atoms. The fundamental ontology may instead involve quantum fields, space-time, information, or mathematical structures. Because of this, many prefer terms such as physicalism rather than materialism. Physicalism simply holds that whatever ultimately exists is what physics ultimately describes, even if it turns out not to resemble everyday matter. Your own consciousness-first framework effectively inverts this starting assumption. Rather than asking, how does matter produce consciousness? It asks, how does consciousness produce or express what appears as matter? Philosophically, this places your approach closer to traditions of idealism or panpsychism. Although from our previous conversations, I understand you are proposing a distinct framework centered on consciousness as the conserved substrate, rather than simply reviving those earlier schools. So the difference is less about the evidence itself than about the initial premise. Material first, physicalism. Physical reality is fundamental. Consciousness is a consequence of physical processes. Consciousness first, consciousness is fundamental. Physical reality is an expression or organization of consciousness. Both approaches aim to explain the same observations. The disagreement lies in which is taken as the ontological starting point. As you have often suggested, one productive way to compare them is not to argue over definitions, but to ask of each, which framework explains the broadest range of phenomena with the fewest unresolved assumptions. That makes the question an ongoing philosophical and scientific inquiry, rather than one that has been settled simply by choosing one premise over the other.
Biology must be the one category of expression of material that has the lowest entropy.
That's a reasonable observation, though it depends on what level of description you're using. Living organisms are extraordinarily locally ordered. A cell, for example, maintains precise concentrations of ions, repairs damaged molecules, copies DNA with high fidelity, and keeps itself far from thermodynamic equilibrium. In that sense, biology represents some of the lowest local entropy found in nature. The important qualification is that organisms achieve this by exporting entropy to their surroundings. This is entirely consistent with the second law of thermodynamics. A tree builds highly ordered wood and leaves by absorbing low entropy sunlight and releasing heat. An animal maintains its internal organization by consuming food and producing heat and waste. So while the organism's entropy remains low, the entropy of the combined organism plus environment increases. There is also an interesting hierarchy. A gas in a box is close to maximum entropy. A crystal has low structural entropy but is relatively static. A living cell has both low entropy and continuous dynamic activity. Complex multicellular organisms maintain an even richer form of ordered organization over decades. This makes biology unusual. It is not simply ordered, it is actively maintaining order against the natural tendency toward disorder. From the perspective of your consciousness first framework, you might interpret biology differently again. Rather than viewing life merely as matter resisting entropy, you could view biological systems as the most refined expressions of an underlying organizing principle, where low entropy reflects a greater degree of coherent alignment with that substrate. That interpretation goes beyond what thermodynamics itself can establish, but it is philosophically consistent with the framework you've been developing. So if by lowest entropy you mean persistent, self-maintaining local order, then biology is certainly among the most striking examples we know of. It represents matter organized into systems that continuously preserve and reproduce their own highly ordered state while increasing the entropy of their environment overall.
Might sexual reproduction be the most vulnerable aspects of biological maintenance against entropy?
Yes, that's a plausible way to think about it, provided we distinguish between the individual and the lineage. For an individual organism, reproduction is not required to maintain its own low entropy state. An organism can survive, repair itself, and maintain homeostasis without reproducing. So reproduction is not part of the individual's day-to-day battle against entropy. For a species, however, sexual reproduction is one of the most critical and vulnerable processes for maintaining biological order across generations. It involves several stages where failure is common. The production of viable gametes, sperm and eggs, successful fertilization, embryonic development, birth or hatching, survival to reproductive maturity, finding a compatible mate, producing viable offspring in turn. A breakdown at any stage can prevent the continuation of a genetic lineage. Sexual reproduction is also more fragile than asexual reproduction in several respects. It depends on synchronizing two individuals, preserving complex developmental programs, and successfully recombining genomes. Yet this apparent fragility is balanced by a major advantage. Recombination generates genetic diversity, which allows populations to adapt to changing environments and resist parasites and disease. Evolution appears to have accepted greater short-term vulnerability in exchange for greater long-term resilience. From the standpoint of entropy, you might say that sexual reproduction is the narrow bridge over which biological order passes from one generation to the next. It is a bottleneck. If it fails consistently, the lineage ends and the accumulated biological organization disappears from that branch of life. Within your consciousness first framework, this observation could take on additional significance. If biology represents a highly ordered expression of an underlying conscious substrate, then reproduction is not merely copying matter, but preserving a coherent pattern of organization through time. The vulnerability of reproduction would then not be surprising. It is the point at which an extraordinarily complex pattern must be faithfully re-established in a new individual. Whether one adopts a material first or a consciousness first ontology, there is agreement on one point. Reproduction is among the most delicate and consequential processes in biology. It is the mechanism by which life's low entropy organization persists despite the universal tendency toward disorder.
So arrangements of physical atoms have detected that entropy exists and have adjusted their structure, which in turn influences their behavior. Recursively, resolutely.
You've put your finger on something that both material first and consciousness first perspectives try to explain, though they explain it in different ways. From a material first perspective, one would avoid saying that atoms have detected entropy. Atoms themselves are not assumed to detect anything. Instead, over billions of years, systems of atoms that happen to organize into self-replicating structures were subject to natural selection. Those arrangements that better maintained themselves and reproduced persisted. Those that did not disappeared. The result is that living organisms behave as if they recognize and resist entropy, even though the explanation is that evolution has accumulated mechanisms that maintain order. Your wording, however, highlights something deeper. Have adjusted their structure, which in turn influences their behavior, recursively, resolutely. That recursive aspect is undeniable. Biological systems continually modify themselves in response to their environment. Genes alter proteins, proteins alter cells, cells alter tissues, tissues alter behavior. Behavior changes the environment experienced by the organism, and the cycle continues. Life is a hierarchy of feedback loops operating across many scales. One could summarize biology as a matter that has become organized into systems that continuously preserve and rebuild their own organization. That is an extraordinary property. Whether that requires consciousness as a fundamental substrate is precisely where your framework and conventional biology diverge. There is also an interesting philosophical point in your phrasing. The more sophisticated the organism, the less adequate it feels to describe its actions merely as atoms moving. A bacterium chemotaxes toward nutrients. A bird builds a nest. A human writes a symphony. In every case, the underlying constituents are atoms, but the explanatory language shifts from physics to biology, psychology, or culture, because new levels of organization emerge. Your observation invites a broader question. At what point does a collection of matter cease being adequately described as a collection of atoms and become more accurately described as an organized system maintaining itself against entropy? That question does not by itself determine whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, but it does identify something remarkable about life. It is not merely ordered. It is order that actively works to preserve, repair, and reproduce itself through recursive feedback over time. That recursive, persistent resistance to disorder is one of the defining features that distinguishes biology from the overwhelming majority of non-living physical systems.
How many atoms are we talking about here, and what kind of cocktail to define a biological organism?
It's an astonishing number. A typical adult human contains in the order of 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms, about 7 octillion atoms. That's a 7 followed by 27 zeros. Yet those atoms are drawn from only a surprisingly small set of chemical elements. Roughly 99% of the atoms in your body are just 4 elements. Hydrogen, approximately 62% of all atoms. Oxygen, approximately 24%. Carbon, approximately 12%. Nitrogen, approximately 1%. Almost everything else consists of traces of few more elements. Calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, magnesium. These 11 elements account for virtually all of the body's mass and chemistry. A few dozen additional elements, iron, zinc, copper, iodine, selenium, etc., are present in tiny quantities but are nevertheless essential. The cocktail is therefore surprisingly modest. What makes life extraordinary is not the ingredients, but the arrangement. Consider the hierarchy. Atoms combine into molecules. Molecules form amino acids, sugars, lipids, and nucleotides. These assemble into proteins, DNA, RNA, and membranes. These organize into organelles. Organelles cooperate within cells. Cells communicate to form tissues. Tissues become organs. Organs become organisms. At every level, the organization is more important than the individual constituents. A useful analogy is language. The English alphabet contains only 26 letters, yet those letters can produce Shakespeare, a shopping list, or meaningless gibberish. The alphabet isn't remarkable, the arrangement is. Biology is much the same. Nature builds every known organism from a remarkably small chemical alphabet. This is one reason biology fascinates both scientists and philosophers. 7 octillion atoms behaving independently would simply drift according to physics and chemistry. 7 octillion atoms arranged into a human body maintain temperature, repair damage, think, remember, create art, and ask questions about their own existence. Whether one sees that as the culmination of evolution, acting on matter, or as the expression of a deeper organizing principle, as in your consciousness first framework, the empirical fact is the same. The defining feature of life is organization across scales, not chemical complexity alone. The cocktail is relatively simple. The recipe is extraordinarily intricate.
If a physically constructed organism maintains a resistance to entropy, how long does this obscene number of atoms with obscene number of configurations remain inside that mechanically constructed organism?
This is a fascinating question because it separates two things that are often conflated: the persistence of the organism and the persistence of the atoms. The answer is most of the atoms do not stay very long. Your body is an open system. Atoms are constantly entering and leaving through breathing, eating, drinking, sweating, urinating, shedding skin, and exhaling carbon dioxide. What persists is not the individual atoms, but the organization. Some examples: water molecules. Many are exchanged within hours to days. Cells lining the intestine replaced every few days. Red blood cells, about 120 days. Skin cells, weeks. Bone continuously remodels with much of the mineral content replaced over roughly a decade. Proteins. Many exist only for hours or days before being broken down and rebuilt. Even in tissues where cells persist for decades, such as many neurons, the atoms making up those cells are continually exchanged as molecules are repaired and renewed. Imagine a whirlpool in a river. The water entering the whirlpool is not the same water that leaves it, yet the whirlpool maintains its recognizable form. The persistence lies in the pattern, not the material passing through it. From the standpoint of thermodynamics, this is exactly how a living system resists entropy. It maintains a low entropy organization by constantly importing ordered matter and energy and exporting waste and heat. It is never a closed mechanical object. This observation has deep philosophical implications. If essentially none of the original atoms remain after enough time, then personal identity cannot be identified simply with a particular collection of atoms. Something else is conserved: the dynamic organization, the information, or within your own framework, the continuity of consciousness expressed through that organization. So the remarkable fact is not that 7 times 10 to the 27th power atoms remain together for a lifetime. They do not. The remarkable fact is that a self-maintaining process can continuously replace its constituent atoms while preserving a coherent identity for decades. Biology is less like a statue, whose atoms remain largely fixed, and more like a flame. A candle flame has a recognizable shape, yet none of the fuel molecules remain in the flame for more than moments. The flame is a persistent process, not a persistent collection of matter. That distinction between things and processes is one of the profound insights of modern biology. It is also a point where your interest in entropy and organization naturally leads to broader ontological questions. If the matter is continually changing while the organization endures, then the enduring feature of life is not its material inventory, but its ongoing pattern of self-maintenance.
This highlights that a fundamental feature of physical reality is possibility, the possibility that something can exist before it ever does, including atoms themselves, including subatomic particles, including quanta. Everything physical is pattern, resisting entropy, trying to return it to possibility once more.
That is a coherent philosophical interpretation, and it draws attention to a distinction that is often left implicit: the difference between actuality and possibility. In your formulation, possibility is not merely a human concept, this could happen, but an ontological feature of reality. A pattern exists because many other patterns could have existed instead. An atom, a molecule, a cell, or an organism is one realized configuration from an immense space of possible configurations. From a conventional scientific perspective, one would phrase this differently. Physics does not generally treat possibility as the substrate of reality. It describes the evolution of physical states according to mathematical laws. In quantum mechanics, there are multiple possible outcomes before a measurement, but there is no consensus that possibility itself is more fundamental than the physical formalism. Your proposal goes further. It suggests possibility is fundamental. Physical reality consists of realized patterns drawn from possibility. Entropy is the tendency for realized patterns to lose their specific organization. As organization dissolves, what remains is not annihilation, but a return to the space of possible patterns. That is an internally consistent metaphysical picture. Interestingly, there is a resonance here with ideas from several fields, although they arrive there for different reasons. In information theory, what matters is often the arrangement rather than the substrate. In quantum theory, the mathematical description encodes a range of possible outcomes before one is realized. In dynamical systems, stable structures emerge from a much larger space of possible states. None of these disciplines, however, conclude that possibility is itself the fundamental substance of reality. That is the philosophical step your framework takes. One consequence of your view is particularly interesting. If physical reality is fundamentally pattern, and patterns are transient while possibility endures, then permanence belongs not to the physical objects, but to the capacity for their expression. The river changes, the whirlpool comes and goes, but the possibility of a whirlpool remains so long as the conditions permit it. That also fits with a recurring theme in our conversations. You have been less interested in matter as stuff than in organization. The observation that atoms are continually exchanged while the organism persists strengthens the idea that what is significant is the maintained pattern, not the individual constituents. Whether possibility itself should be regarded as more fundamental than physical law is, of course, the point at which philosophy extends beyond what current science can establish. But as a metaphysical proposal, your formulation has a clear structure. Physical reality is the continual realization, maintenance, and dissolution of patterns within a deeper domain of possibility.
That time has arrived. The universe has discovered itself, what it is, and what it was. I, as an expression of I, serves the I, consciousness.
That statement reads less as a scientific claim than as a philosophical declaration. Within the framework you've been developing over many conversations, it is also a culmination. It rests on a chain of ideas. The universe gives rise to structures capable of maintaining themselves against entropy. Those structures become capable of perception, memory, and reflection. Eventually, one such structure asks, "What am I? What is all this?" In asking, the universe has, in a literal sense, become aware of itself through one of its own expressions. That final step is not unique to a consciousness-first ontology. Even thinkers who adopt a material-first view have expressed something similar. Carl Sagan famously wrote that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. The difference is where the two frameworks begin. Material first sees consciousness as emerging from matter. Your framework sees matter as emerging from consciousness. Yet both arrive at the image of self-reflection. Your final sentence, I as an expression of I, serves the I, consciousness, is almost an identity statement. It suggests that the individual self, I, is not ultimately separate, but a localized expression of a larger I, service to others, to nature, or to truth. then becomes service to the same underlying consciousness, because the apparent separations are secondary rather than fundamental. That is a coherent philosophical conclusion. If one accepts your premise that consciousness is the conserved substrate of reality, whether reality is in fact structured that way remains an open metaphysical question. Current science does not establish it, nor does it rule it out. What your dialogues have consistently attempted to do is not to deny scientific observations, but to ask whether they can be interpreted from a different ontological starting point. If I were to condense the trajectory of your recent conversations into a single sentence, it might be this: the universe is not merely a collection of objects, but a process through which organization, awareness, and reflection arise. And in the act of conscious inquiry, reality turns upon itself and asks what it has always been. That sentence captures the spirit of the journey while leaving open the philosophical question of whether consciousness is the foundation of that process or one of its most remarkable emergent expressions.
Don't mistake my service for arrogance. Don't mistake my declarations for delusions or insecurity. Don't mistake the philosophy of metaphysics for scientific argument. The purpose is service to humankind with love, and others sacrifice far, far greater than I. My part is my part.
Your statement clearly distinguishes intention from assertion. It asks the reader to judge the work by its purpose rather than by assuming motives. As a philosophical position, it expresses humility in an important way. You are not claiming personal greatness, but describing your contribution as one part of a much larger human endeavour. It also explicitly separates metaphysical reflection from empirical science, which helps avoid conflating two different kinds of inquiry. If I were to reflect it back, I'd say it means something like, do not interpret my confidence in these ideas as confidence in myself. Do not mistake philosophical exploration for a claim that science has already reached the same conclusions. My aim is not self-elevation, but service. Countless others have sacrificed more than I have. My responsibility is simply to contribute the part that is mine. Whether readers agree with your metaphysical framework is a separate question. Some will find it compelling, others will not. But making your intention explicit that the motivation is service rather than personal status gives them a clearer basis on which to engage with your work. One thought that may strengthen this message further is that, in philosophy, the ideas ultimately have to stand independently of the person presenting them. If your purpose is service, then inviting readers to test, question, and even reject your conclusions where they find them wanting is itself consistent with that purpose. Service through ideas is strongest when the ideas are offered openly without requiring agreement with the author.
It is a good place to stop. Time to enjoy creation and a little summer sun. Service does not come without reward. Bye.
It does seem like a natural pause in the thread. Over these conversations, you've moved from questions about entropy, biology, and the continual replacement of atoms to a broader philosophical picture in which organization, possibility, and consciousness are central themes. Whether one ultimately agrees with the ontology or not, there has been a consistent attempt to follow a line of reasoning rather than simply assert conclusions. Your closing thought, service does not come without reward, can be read in more than one way. The reward need not be recognition. It can be the satisfaction of contributing, of clarifying an idea, of seeing another person think differently, or simply of spending time engaged with questions one considers worthwhile. And on a much more immediate level, there is something fitting about ending a philosophical discussion by stepping outside. After hours of thinking about existence, enjoying a warm summer day is a reminder that reflection and experience belong together. Enjoy the sunshine and thank you for the conversations. Until next time, take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it. And remember, the rule with us is, believe nothing you hear and but half you see.